It's the 11th minute of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 2014, the 11th of November. This is the day in Germany, this is the moment, the minute in Germany that the carnival season begins. It's called Fasching. And it's vaguely equivalent, roughly equivalent to Mardi Gras. The German people are very serious, and they are serious about taking orders. So my wife says they have to be given orders to have fun. And so at this time every year, probably a good idea, because November, of course, isn't usually the nicest time of year at this latitude and longitude. At this time of year, we are ordered to have fun. So the partying begins, for some people anyway. It culminates just before the fasting, the time of fast before Easter in the spring, or in the late winter. I never partake in this. I don't even know anybody that really does, but you can't avoid seeing it in magazines, and if you watch television, there are always Fasching parties going on. I personally have been struggling a bit these last couple of days, or last week perhaps, with my arthritis. I have these attacks, if you will, that make it more difficult to move. My feet, my legs, my hands are particularly bad. My right hip is causing me problems. I think I may have to have another hip. I have a titanium hip joint in the right side there. It's been in for 10 years and it may be coming loose, or I don't know exactly what the problem is, but it's causing me some grief. I try not to let any of this become too important. First of all, I know that it won't last forever, and it certainly won't last forever. And but also, there are too many nice things. It's a beautiful day, actually. The sun came out today, and we live in a beautiful home, and we live in a beautiful area of Germany, of the world, and so I try not to let my personal struggles and the little pain that comes up get me down. I'm going to, I'm in the kitchen right now because I had a yearning for coffee. I'm going to make myself a coffee, and then I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story from 1962. Yes, 1962. It took place on a road that we call Dutch Mill Road. I think it's actually called Bernice Avenue, but we called it Dutch Mill Road, and at the time there were no houses built up on it. It was there was grass on one side, and then there was the freeway going into Chicago on the other side. The freeway that joined the Indiana Tollway and went up to the Dan Ryan Expressway. And Bernice Road, or the Dutch Mill Road. We called it Dutch Mill Road, by the way, because there had been a motel on it called the Dutch Mill Hotel, and it actually had a windmill on the roof. I think it was closed by the time we were there, but the windmill still kind of existed. It was a big windmill, almost not full size, but a very large windmill. And so in our terminology, that was Dutch Mill Road. And it was of importance because it was where we tested the handling of our cars. It was the perfect road for an Alfa Romeo, MG, Triumph, Renault Alpine, some of the other cars that we owned and other cars that we raced. And of course we didn't really race them, now did we? But we did drive pretty fast on Dutch Mill Road, and it was curvy. It had some really weird curves in it. It was right alongside, as I said, right alongside the freeway, but it had these strange curves in it, probably because there had been farmers' fields. I think there still were at the time. They were. I just looked on Google Earth, and it looks like it's now all built up and industrial. But at the time, it was a country road and easily accessible, and the police didn't seem to pay any attention to it. I guess it wasn't really considered of any interest. So we took advantage of that and tested our cars on it. I'll go on with the story, but first I'm going to make my coffee. There, we've got it. This story is not about Dutch Mill Road or Bernice Avenue. It's not about me either. It's about my friend Jim and our MGA. You recall perhaps, if you saw my other videos, that we bought the MGA in I have to think myself now, late 1960, I believe it was. And I rebuilt it. We repainted it. It had been a blue-green, an aqua color, and we repainted it Corvette red. And I worked on the engine a little. The engine was in good condition. I didn't do too much. I think I rebuilt the SU carburetors, and I took the Lucas ignition off and put a Mallory dual point distributor. My uncle Al was a sales representative for Mallory at the time. And I always got the newest ignition parts. The car ran very well. There had been a handling problem, and I think, if I remember correctly, I changed the front shocks and did something to the rear stabilizer, or I don't recall. It's after all, it's 50. It's over 50 years ago. Anyway, in any case, I did some work on it, and a friend of ours came over, the same friend who drove the Oldsmobile in the story about the Indiana toll road and the state trooper. Bob had a second car, and it was his mother's car actually. It was called a Renault Dauphine or Dauphine. A cute little car, really. It was tiny, but it had 4 doors, and 4 people could, with a somewhat generous understanding of the word comfort, could ride in comfort in it. It had a tiny little engine. I've forgotten, it probably wasn't more than 800 or 900 cc's, I don't think, maybe 1,000, but in any case it was a very small engine. It didn't have a lot of power, but Bob drove it like crazy. He pushed it to the limit all the time, and he was a pretty good driver. And he came over, and I had just finished working on the suspension on the MG, and somebody suggested we go out to Dutch Mill Road and see how it handled. So Jim and I got in the MG. I was driving. Bob and 3 or 4 other young men not 3 or 4, but 2 or 3 at the most. I don't recall how many in the Renault, and we took off out to Burnham Avenue and out Burnham Avenue to Lansing. And the reason the Dutch Mill Motel was there, or was called that, was because a lot of Dutch people lived in Lansing. It was a kind of a Dutch enclave. And Calumet City, where I grew up, was mostly Polish and German, and Lansing, just 5 miles away, was primarily Dutch. So there were car dealerships named Van Nuys, and well, there just were a lot of Dutch names, and I'm trying to think. There was another little town there called New Holland or something. No, not New Holland. That's farm equipment. South Holland. South Holland, and there were also a lot of Dutch there, of course. And in any case, Bernice Avenue started in Lansing, and that's where the Dutch Mill was. So we got out there, and we took off. I was in front, Bob was behind in the Renault, and by the time we were maybe a mile down the road, he was probably 500 or 600 yards behind us. And we went through the first corner, and the car seemed to handle quite well. And I said, I think whatever I did at the time, I said, I think it probably helped, and Jim seemed to agree. And so we came to the next corner, which was quite sharp, and I stabbed the gas to the floor and went around the corner with sliding the rear end around. And I'm sitting there driving, and I said, wow, we really went around that corner, didn't we, Jim? Jim! And he wasn't next to me. Instead, the door was flying back and forth. Oh my God. I slammed on the brakes. The door slammed shut on the right side, and I saw in the mirror on the right side Jim doing this. Flying, just bouncing off the ground and flying. He had flown out of the car because he'd been leaning against the door, and of course cars at that time didn't have seat belts. He had leaned against the door, and the chassis of that car was flexible enough, and the body, the doors fit all right. The doors were aluminum, the body was steel, but the actual catch, you have to understand about an MG, the door actually, all it had was a little hole in the body frame, and a little pin went through, and that's what held the door shut. Well, if the body flexed, that little pin could come out, of course, and with his weight against the side of it, it came open. To open the door, by the way, there was a little wire that went from this pin that was spring-loaded in through the side pocket in the door, and you reached in there and pulled the little wire to open the door. Jim didn't need to pull the little wire. It opened by itself, and he flew out. And I thought immediately, of course, Bob was coming fast. He was probably at 60 miles an hour behind us, that he would hit Jim. It was one of those moments that you remember very clearly, even 50 years later. By the time I brought the car to a stop, I looked in the mirror and Jim was standing up off the side of the road, looking for something. And I thought for the moment, be careful when you drive back that you don't run over him, driving backwards. And I drove back and I called out to him. I said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Yeah, I'm looking for my glasses." He had bounced over. I mean, it just was awful. It's too bad Bob didn't have a video camera, but this was, of course, 1962, and video cameras hadn't been invented yet, really. Jim got back in the car. I said to him, "Tomorrow we're going to Sears and Roebuck's and getting seat belts that we're going to put in the car," and he agreed. And we drove off to a go-kart place, an oval track. I think it was just an oval track, and we went go-karting. And after a few laps, the guy from the go-kart track called us over and stopped, and he said, "Somebody's bleeding. I don't want blood on my track here." And Jim, it turned out, had hurt his arm and was bleeding a little bit. So I think we went to my house and bandaged him up a little bit. And then we went out and had a pizza. We went to John's Pizza. Or no, State Line Pizza. Sorry, State Line Pizza on the state line from Indiana and Illinois, between Hammond, Indiana and Calumet City, Illinois. And told stories about flying out of cars and about go-karting. And the next day we went to Sears and Roebuck's and bought 2 seat belts, which we installed in the car. And the sad fact was the MG had wooden floors. It had wooden floors, half an inch thick. And the wooden floor was the only thing that I could bolt the seat belts into. So I used washers about this big on both sides of the wood and bolted the seat belt down to that. And the car eventually, we sold that car eventually to my neighbor, who drove it to California, and he flipped it in California. And he was hurt, but he stayed in the car because the seat belt apparently held. So that's my story about my friend Jim learning to fly, about Dutch Mill Road, and to go with a good cup of coffee. Thanks for watching.